My name is Dr. Eris Thorne. In the high-stakes theater of molecular physics, a name is everything. It's your legacy, your currency, and your ultimate shield against the vultures of academia. I grew up in a house where the dinner table was a seminar, and the walls were lined with the gilded accolades of my father's ego. I was raised to believe we were a team, a collective of brilliant minds pushing the boundaries of the known universe for the betterment of mankind. I spent 3 agonizing years in a windowless basement laboratory, breathing in the sharp scent of ozone and liquid nitrogen, obsessively perfecting the Thorne-Eris equation that promised to revolutionize clean energy forever. But when the light finally broke through the darkness of the variables, I was shoved back into the shadows by the very people who shared my blood. My family didn't see a colleague or a daughter, they saw a ghostwriter with an inconvenient pulse. They believed they could strip my name from the discovery to keep the prestige pure and the hierarchy intact. They didn't realize that a scientific discovery is a living, breathing entity, and without the mind that conceived its soul, their stolen glory was nothing more than a ticking bomb of catastrophic mathematical errors. The rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the particle decelerator had been my only true lullaby for over 1,000 nights. In the subterranean silence of the Thorne Estate's private lab, time didn't move in hours, but in iterations of code and the slow cooling of superconducting magnets. My eyes were a roadmap of broken capillaries, my lab coat was stained with graphite and silver nitrate, and my hands shook from a diet consisting mostly of caffeine and adrenaline. But as the final simulation flickered across the ultra-wide monitors, the shaking stopped. The data was beautiful. It was a crystalline symphony of numbers that finally solved the thermal instability problem in cold fusion, the holy grail that had eluded my father's generation for 40 years. I had cracked the code. I had tamed the star. I climbed the narrow stairs from the basement, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was clutching the encrypted drive to my chest as if it were a holy relic, a piece of the future captured in silicon. I burst into the dining room, expecting a celebration, a moment of shared triumph that would finally justify the years of isolation. My father, Dr. Victor Thorne, sat at the head of the long mahogany table, nursing a glass of vintage scotch that cost more than my monthly research stipend. My brother, Julian, was slumped in a velvet chair, lazily scrolling through prestigious grant applications on his tablet. My mother, the family's strategic coordinator, was busy drafting a press release for an event that hadn't even happened yet. The air in the room was thick with the scent of old money and unearned confidence. "Father, Julian, I've finished the final calibration," I said, my voice cracking with exhaustion and raw joy. "The stability threshold held at 99.9%. The equation is stable. The project is complete." Victor Thorne didn't jump for joy. He didn't even stand up. He set his crystal glass down with a slow, deliberate click that echoed through the silent room. He looked at me with the detached clinical curiosity he usually reserved for a slide under a microscope. "Bring it here, Eris," his voice a low academic rumble that commanded obedience. I handed over the drive. He plugged it into his workstation, his eyes scanning the millions of lines of complex calculus I had bled for. Julian leaned over his shoulder, his bored expression slowly melting into a mask of avarice. "It's flawless," Julian whispered, his voice thick with a sudden predatory hunger. "Father, this isn't just a government grant. This is the Global Energy Prize. This is scientific immortality. We'll be in every textbook for the next century." "Yes," my father agreed, his gaze finally shifting to me, but there was no pride in his eyes, only a cold, calculating assessment. It is a masterpiece, Eris, truly. However, we have a significant logistical hurdle regarding the official publication. The committee at the International Science Council is traditional. They are looking for a singular, authoritative voice, a veteran with decades of peer-reviewed weight. "What are you saying?" I asked, a sudden icy knot forming in the pit of my stomach. "We've already discussed the branding, dear," my mother said, stepping into the light with a sharp, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The paper will be published under the names of Dr. Victor Thorne and Julian Thorne. Your name, Eris, well, let's be realistic. You're young, you lack a doctorate from an Ivy League institution, and having a daughter listed as a primary author on a breakthrough of this magnitude would look like nepotism. It would muddy the waters. It would ruin the perceived solidity of the research in the eyes of the board." "Nepotism?" I gasped, the room starting to spin. "I wrote every line of that code. I ran the simulations for 18 hours a day while you were at charity galas and faculty dinners. Julian hasn't touched a pipette or an integral in over a year. He wouldn't even know how to recalibrate the sensors." "Eris, don't be so dramatic," Julian snapped, leaning back and crossing his arms. "You'll be compensated, of course. We'll set up a very generous consultation fee through the family trust. You'll never have to worry about funding again. But for the sake of the Thorne legacy, for the sake of the billion-dollar grant that will fund this entire estate, you must remain in the background. You're a Thorne. Isn't the victory of the family name enough for you?" "The name is mine as much as it is yours," I shouted, the betrayal cutting deeper than any physical wound. "That is enough." My father slammed his fist onto the table, the scotch sloshing over the rim of the glass. He stood up, towering over me with the oppressive weight of 40 years of academic authority and patriarchal power. "The data is currently on our secure servers. The encryption has been updated to my personal master key. As of this moment, you are a junior research assistant, Eris, nothing more. If you attempt to claim authorship, I will personally see to it that you are blacklisted from every major laboratory and university from here to Geneva. Who would the world believe? A Nobel nominee with a chest full of medals, or his disgruntled, unqualified daughter suffering from a perceived grievance?" I looked at them then, really looked at them. They weren't a family, they were a cartel. They had mined my intellect, refined my passion, and were now discarding the slag once they had secured the gold. My mother was already typing, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she removed my name from the digital manuscript. "Fine," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying quiet whisper. "Keep the paper, keep the stage, keep the stolen glory. But remember this, Father, the math is mine, and math has a brutal, uncompromising way of correcting its own imbalances." I didn't wait for a reply. I walked out of that room, up to my bedroom, and packed a single suitcase. I didn't take any of the equipment they had bought for me. I didn't take my fancy Thorne-branded stationery. I took only my personal handwritten notebooks and the one thing their arrogance had caused them to overlook, the final correction factor for the thermal expansion variable. In the version of the equation my father had just stolen, there was a tiny microscopic flaw in the 7th decimal place of the heat sink algorithm. It was irrelevant for a short-term laboratory simulation, but in a full-scale high-load reactor, it would lead to a cascading thermal shutdown within 6 months of continuous activation. I had discovered it in the final, exhausted hour of my research and had planned to apply the fix that morning. I left the error in the code. I left the bomb ticking in their immortality. I spent the next 5 years in a state of self-imposed strategic exile. I moved to Zurich under a pseudonym, changing my appearance and my life. I worked 10 times harder than anyone else, climbing the invisible ladder of the International Regulatory Committee for Energy Standards, IRC. I didn't publish papers. I didn't chase awards. I became the ghost in the machine of global science, the silent auditor who vets the giants and signs the death warrants of failed projects. In the meantime, the Thorne family became the kings of the New World. Victor and Julian were the faces of the energy renaissance. They were on the cover of Time. They were the darlings of the Davos Summit, and they had secured $5 billion in private investment to build the first Thorne-class reactor. They were basking in a light they didn't know how to sustain, built on a foundation of sand and stolen math. Until the first cascading thermal shutdown occurred at their pilot plant in Nevada. I sat in my high-back leather chair at the IRC headquarters in Stockholm, watching the frantic news reports of the Thorne reactor's mysterious.
The Grand Hall in Stockholm was a cathedral of vanity, draped in heavy velvet and lit by chandeliers that cost more than a dozen research grants. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the hushed, reverent whispers of the global scientific elite. My father, Dr. Victor Thorne, stood at the center of a swirling galaxy of admirers, his chest already puffed out in anticipation of the medal he was about to receive. Beside him, Julian was playing the part of the refined prodigy, shaking hands with ambassadors and flashing his practiced, hollow smile for the cameras. They looked invincible. They looked like gods of the new age. But I could see the sweat on my father's brow, the way his eyes darted toward the entrance every time a technician in a black headset walked past. They knew. The Nevada pilot plant was bleeding energy. The cascading shutdowns I had predicted 5 years ago were no longer theoretical. They were a systemic hemorrhage that was draining billions from their investors every single hour. They were standing on a stage made of glass, and I was the only one who knew where the first crack started. I stood in the shadows of the mezzanine, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a pair of spectacles that hid the fire in my eyes. My official credentials hung around my neck. Dr. A. Vesper, chairperson of the International Oversight Committee, IOC. To the world, I was a rising star in regulatory science. To my family, I was a ghost they had buried and forgotten. Dr. Vesper, the committee is ready for the preliminary hearing, my assistant whispered. The Thorne delegation is requesting a private session to discuss the technical anomalies before the award ceremony. Let them wait, I said, my voice as cold as liquid nitrogen. Let them sweat in the light of their own dying sun. We will see them in 30 minutes. When the heavy doors of the hearing room finally opened, Victor and Julian entered with their usual air of unearned authority. They didn't even look at the panel of auditors. They looked at the table, at the microphones, at anything but the people who held their fate. "This is an outrage," Julian began, slamming his leather portfolio onto the table. "We are here to receive a state honor, not to be interrogated by a board of accountants. The Nevada issue is a minor sensor calibration error. It will be resolved within the week." "A minor error, Mr. Thorne," I said, leaning forward into the circle of light. I kept my voice low, modulated, and stripped of the daughterly softness they once exploited. "According to the real-time telemetry my team intercepted this morning, the core temperature at your facility is fluctuating by 300 degrees every 10 seconds. That isn't a sensor error. That is a fundamental breakdown of the Thorne-Eris equation." At the sound of the name, Thorne-Eris, My father's head snapped up. He looked at me, squinting through the glare of the spotlights. He didn't recognize my face, but he recognized the rhythm of my speech. He recognized the way I dissected the data. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a sudden, sharp fear. "I am the chairperson of the committee that decides whether your reactor is a breakthrough or a public safety hazard. And currently, Dr. Thorne, I am leaning toward the latter. Your math is failing. Why?" "The math is perfect," Victor shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "I spent 40 years on those variables. The logic is sound." "Is it?" I stood up, walking slowly toward the large digital whiteboard at the front of the room. I picked up a stylus and began to write. I didn't write the version they had published. I wrote the raw, unpolished version I had calculated in the basement lab 5 years ago. I wrote the 7th decimal place of the heat sink algorithm. The room went deathly silent. My father's glass of water slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. Julian went pale, his eyes widening as he stared at the correction I was making in glowing ink. That variable," Julian stammered. "It's not in the master manuscript. Where did you get that?" "I got it from the source, Julian," I said, turning to face them. I pulled off my glasses and stepped into the full light. "I got it from the basement, from the daughter you called unqualified, from the scientists whose name you said would muddy the waters." "Eris!" my mother gasped from the back of the room, her silk scarf fluttering as she stood up. "Dr. Thorne to you, mother," I corrected her. "And as of this moment, the IOC is issuing an immediate cease and desist order for the Nevada facility. We are also freezing the grant money and initiating a full forensic audit of the original research data." "You can't do this," Victor roared, lunging toward the table. "You're biased. This is personal vendetta. We'll have you removed." "On what grounds?" I asked, a predatory smile touching my lips. "I am the only person on this committee who actually understands how to fix the error that is currently melting your billion-dollar investment. If you remove me, you remove your only chance of survival. But here's the problem, Father. I'm not here to fix your reactor. I'm here to autopsy it." "Eris, please," Julian pleaded, his arrogance finally collapsing into a pathetic desperation. "Think of the family. If this goes public, we're ruined. We'll be the biggest laughingstock in the history of science. We can add your name now. We'll issue a correction. We'll say it was a clerical error." "A clerical error that lasted 5 years and cost $5 billion? I laughed, a sharp metallic sound. "No, Julian, you wanted the solidity of a Thorne-only discovery. Well, now you have it. You have the full weight of a failing legacy, and you're going to carry it all the way to the bottom." I turned to my assistant. "Notify the Grand Hall. Tell them the award ceremony for the Grand Cross of Scientific Merit is canceled. Instead, we will be holding a press conference. Topic: the systemic failure of the Thorne reactor and the recovery of stolen intellectual property." I walked past my father, who was slumped in his chair, a man who had finally realized he didn't steal a discovery, he stole a debt he could never pay. As I opened the doors to the Grand Hall, the flashes of 100 cameras exploded in my face. For 5 years, I had been the ghost. Today, I was the sun, and I was going to burn every lie they had ever told.
The aftermath of the canceled ceremony felt like a controlled demolition. The Grand Hall, once a temple of prestige, had turned into a shark tank. My father and Julian had retreated to a private suite in the Grand Hotel, surrounding themselves with high-priced crisis lawyers and PR firms specializing in reputation salvage. They weren't fighting for the science anymore, they were fighting for the brand. I sat in the IOC war room, the glow of 6 monitors reflecting in my tired eyes. My team was deep in the forensic audit of the Thorne servers. Dr. Vesper, or should I say Dr. Thorne, we've hit a wall, my lead analyst said, pointing to a redacted block of code. They've wiped the metadata from the 2021 uploads. There's no digital signature linking you to the original files. Legally, it's their word against your memory. They were thorough, I whispered, tracing the lines of the stolen equation. They spent 5 years scrubbing the basement clean, but they forgot that I didn't just work in that lab. I lived in it. The next morning, the counterattack began. My father appeared on a national morning show, looking like a grieving patriarch. He didn't look angry, he looked disappointed. "It's a tragedy," Victor told the interviewer, his voice trembling with practiced sorrow. "Our daughter, Eris, she's struggled with the pressure of our family's expectations. She had a breakdown years ago and disappeared. To see her resurface now, weaponizing a position of power to sabotage her brother's and father's life's work, it breaks a parent's heart. These corrections she claims to have made, they are the delusions of a brilliant but troubled mind seeking relevance." The headline below his face read, "The Thorne Tragedy, Battle Over the Sun." By noon, the internet was flooded with leaked medical records, forged, of course, suggesting I had been under psychiatric care during the years I was supposedly inventing the equation. They were trying to paint me as the villain of a psychological thriller, a jealous sibling trying to burn the house down because she wasn't invited to the party. "They're winning the public, Eris," my assistant said, looking at the plummeting approval ratings of the IOC investigation. "The board is under pressure to reinstate the Thorne grant. They want a face-to-face confrontation, a public hearing." "Good," I said, standing up and smoothing my jacket. "Give them the stage. Invite the press. Invite the Nobel Committee. Tell my father that I accept his challenge. We'll settle the authorship once and for all in the Grand Auditorium." The hearing was broadcast live to millions. The auditorium was a sea of cameras and hushed anticipation. My father and Julian sat at a long mahogany table, flanked by lawyers. I sat alone at a small podium, my laptop closed. "Dr. Victor Thorne, or should I say Dr. Eris Thorne, you claim that the Thorne-Eris equation was a collaboration between yourself and your son Julian. Do you have any proof that Eris Thorne was merely a technical assistant, as you claimed in your deposition?" "The records speak for themselves," Victor said, his voice booming with regained confidence. "Every file, every simulation, every patent is under our names. Eris was a child playing with blocks while we were building a cathedral. She has no proof, no emails, no logs, nothing." "And you, Dr. Eris Thorne," the judge turned to me, "do you have anything beyond your word and your knowledge of a rounding error that could have been guessed by any expert in the field?" I stood up. I didn't look at the cameras. I looked directly at my father. "I don't have emails, Father. You made sure of that. And I don't have logs. You wiped the servers. But I do have a hobby you always found annoying. Do you remember my soundscape project, the one where I recorded the ambient noise of the lab to study how vibrations affected the particle decelerator's stability?" My father's face froze. A tiny, microscopic twitch started in his left eyelid. I had a high-fidelity acoustic sensor running 24/7 in that basement for 3 years. It wasn't connected to the Thorn network. It was an analog backup stored on an old-fashioned magnetic tape drive. It didn't just record the hum of the machines, it recorded the room. I pressed play. The speakers crackled with the white noise of a cooling system. Then a voice broke through, clear, sharp, and unmistakably mine. "Father, the expansion variable is dragging. I've shifted the 7th decimal to compensate. Look at the monitor, it's holding." Then came my father's voice, younger, filled with a raw, unscripted excitement. "My God, Eris, you'd actually done it. The IOC will never believe a 24-year-old solved this problem. We'll need to package this carefully. We'll put my name first to ensure the funding, then yours. We'll make you the queen of the department." The room went so silent you could hear the heartbeat of the person sitting next to you. But the recording didn't stop. It jumped forward 6 months to the night of the bonfire. "Julian, delete the Eris manifest file from the primary drive. She's leaving tonight. If her name is on that paper, the grant will be tied up in her youthful lack of credentials for a decade. We need the money now. She's a thorn. She'll understand eventually. It's for the solidity of the research." "What if she fights us, Father?" Julian asked. "She won't. She's nothing without this lab. I'll blacklist her before she can even reach a phone. Now burn the hard copies, every single one." The click of the stop button felt like a gunshot. Julian was staring at the table, his face the color of ash. My mother was slumped in her seat, her hand over her mouth. My father looked like a man who had finally met the ghost he thought he'd laid to rest. That is an illegal recording," Victor's lawyer stammered with a weak voice. "Inadmissible." "This isn't a criminal court, counselor. This is a hearing of the scientific community, and we have just heard the sound of the most shameful theft in the history of our profession." I stood up and closed my laptop. "The math was mine, Father, but the silence belonged to you. I think I've heard enough." I walked out of the auditorium as the first wave of reporters surged toward the Thorn table. The energy renaissance was over, the trial of the century was about to begin, and as I stepped into the cool Stockholm air, I realized that for the first time in 5 years, I didn't have to whisper. The truth was finally at a volume the whole world could hear.
The grand auditorium of the International Science Council didn't feel like a hall of celebration anymore. It had been transformed into a cold, clinical theater of scientific reckoning. The plush velvet seats were filled with the most powerful minds in physics, but the usual atmosphere of collegial warmth had been replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Every eye in the room was fixed on the defense table, where the Thorn dynasty sat like a pair of crumbling monuments. The recording I had played, the acoustic ghost of my own betrayal, had vibrated through the world's news cycles for 48 hours. It had stripped the Thorn name of every shred of its stolen prestige, leaving only the raw, ugly truth of a father who had traded his daughter's future for a government grant. My father, Dr. Victor Thorn, sat with his head bowed, his once imposing shoulders slumped as if the gravity of his own lies was finally more than his spine could support. Beside him, Julian was a hollow shell of the man he had been a week ago. He stared blankly at the polished mahogany table, his hands trembling slightly every time a camera shutter clicked in the gallery. The golden boy of physics was now the most notorious pariah in the field. The High Chancellor of the Science Council stood up, his face as stern as a judge delivering a life sentence. "Dr. Eris Thorn," the Chancellor announced, his voice echoing with an absolute, undeniable authority.
Based on the acoustic evidence, the forensic audit of the lab notebooks you provided from your period of uncredited residency, and the catastrophic failure of the Nevada facility under the published Thorne parameters, this council has reached a unanimous verdict. We officially strike the names of Victor and Julian Thorne from the patent for cold fusion stability. We formally and permanently recognize you and you alone as the primary author, inventor, and intellectual architect of this breakthrough. A wave of hushed whispers rippled through the crowd, like the sound of a distant ocean. I stood at my own small table, my back straight, my expression unreadable. I didn't feel the surge of petty joy I had once imagined. Instead, I felt a strange, crystalline clarity, the same feeling I had when a complex equation finally settled into its simplest form. Furthermore, the Chancellor continued, looking at my father with a gaze of pure professional disdain, the Council is recommending the immediate revocation of all academic titles held by Victor Thorne and a lifetime ban for Julian Thorne from any publicly funded research or university faculty positions. The fraud committed here, the deliberate silencing of a primary researcher for the sake of optics, is a stain on our profession that can only be cleansed by total and absolute accountability. The room erupted in a frenzy of motion as journalists scrambled to get the first shot of the disgraced Titans. I walked slowly toward the central podium. I didn't look at the press. I didn't look at the Nobel representatives in the front row. I looked directly at the two men who had shared my dinner table while planning my professional execution. The reactor in Nevada is currently 38 minutes away from a total core meltdown. The rounding error you ignored, the one you called a minor sensor glitch, has reached its thermodynamic tipping point. My father and brother have spent the last 48 hours trying to override the system with brute force algorithms, only to make the instability worse. They are trying to extinguish a sun with a bucket of water. Julian whispered with a pathetic, desperate hope that made my skin crawl. Please, if you have the fix, if you actually have the stabilization code, give it to us. We can still save the facility. We can still save the investment. We can make a deal. We'll give you everything. I'm not giving it to you, Julian. I opened my laptop and connected it to the massive digital screens that dominated the stage. On the monitors, the real-time telemetry from the Nevada plant was flashing a violent, rhythmic red. The heart of the star had finally found its balance. The crisis was over, not because of a Thorne miracle, but because the truth had been allowed to run. The roar of the crowd was deafening, a wall of sound that would have terrified me 5 years ago. Now it was just background noise. I walked away from the podium before the first reporter could reach me, stepping down to the defense table where my father sat, staring at his empty hands. He looked up at me as I approached. There were no masks left. No patronizing Victor Thorne lecture. He looked like an old man who had realized too late that he had traded his daughter's love for a medal that had just been stripped from his chest by the very daughter he tried to erase. You ruined us, he rasped, his eyes watery and red-rimmed. You took everything, the house in the hills, the funding, the prestige. We have nothing. Julian will never work again. My legacy is a punchline. You had nothing 5 years ago, Father. I leaned down so only he could hear me. You just had a very expensive set of stolen clothes and a house built on my silence. You told me my name would muddy the waters. Well, the waters are clear now, and you're the only one who can't swim in them. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, plain white envelope. I placed it on the table between them. "What's this?" my father asked, his fingers trembling as he touched the paper. "It's the address of a small, private laboratory in the Jura Mountains," I said, my voice devoid of malice. "It's basic. It has a particle decelerator, a cooling system, and enough nitrogen to keep you busy. There are no mahogany tables, no scotch, and no cameras. If you and Julian actually care about the science, if you actually remember how to be physicists instead of celebrities, you can work there, as my junior research assistants, on a trial basis. You will report to my lead auditor every Friday." I didn't wait for his answer. I knew he wouldn't take it. His ego was a terminal disease, and he couldn't survive in a room where he wasn't the master of the light. But I had given him the choice, the same choice he'd denied me when he pulled the plug on my career in that basement. I walked out of the auditorium, ignoring the frantic shouting of the world's press. I walked through the grand hall, under the portraits of the giants who had come before me, and stepped out into the crisp, cold air of the Stockholm night. The stars above were bright, but for the first time in history, they weren't the only source of pure, clean light in the universe. I looked at my hands. They weren't shaking anymore. They were steady, stained with the ink of a history I had rewritten myself. My name is Aris. I am a scientist, and for the first time in my life, the math is perfectly, beautifully balanced. The experiment is over.